Flight 627 soared above the Nevada desert, glinting like a silver arrow against the sprawling blue sky. Inside, 92 souls were lost in their own worlds, each cocooned in thoughts, fears, or fleeting happiness. A mother in 17B struggled to calm her toddler, whose tiny fists banged against the tray table as he babbled questions about clouds and monsters. Across the aisle, a businessman in 4D tapped frantically on his laptop, deadlines looming and phone notifications flashing like warnings in the dim cabin light. A young couple in 22C and 22D held hands tightly, exchanging nervous laughter as their honeymoon journeyed forward, oblivious to the miles beneath them. The soft hum of engines and the occasional click of a seatbelt formed a rhythm, a lullaby that reassured passengers or lulled them into a false sense of security. Captain David Reynolds sat in the cockpit with the calm of a man who had seen every scenario imaginable in his 20-year aviation career. His eyes flicked over the instruments, reading altitude, speed, and fuel with the precision of a surgeon. Beside him, First Officer Laura Chen typed coordinates into the navigation system, her fingers moving with mechanical certainty. Reynolds lifted a hand in acknowledgement, signaling a routine check. Everything was normal. Everything was calm. Too calm. In row 17, elderly Mr. Caldwell dozed, his thinning hair catching the sunlight streaming through the window, while next to him, a teenage boy stared at a cracked phone screen, headphones drowning out the cabin chatter. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, smiling, checking on passengers, offering drinks or blankets. Sarah Mitchell, a senior attendant with 9 years on the airline, paused near 14C, noticing the subtle signs of anxiety on the boy's face. "Everything's fine, hun," she said softly, brushing back his messy hair. He nodded but didn't remove the headphones. At 11,000 meters above the desert floor, the plane was a fortress of air and metal, seemingly untouchable, almost serene. Reynolds sipped his lukewarm coffee, feeling the vibrations of the engines beneath his fingers. He loved this view, the world flattened, endless, beautiful. It was peaceful. It was routine. But experience had taught him that peace was often deceptive. It was the moments between chaos that were most dangerous. As Reynolds glanced at the radar, a small flicker caught his eye, a blip too small to concern him but noticeable. He shrugged, telling himself it was likely a technical anomaly. Pilots saw anomalies every day. He adjusted the throttle slightly, humming a low tune under his breath. The cockpit door clicked shut behind him, the seal a reminder of the divide between controlled chaos above the clouds and the fragile lives below. In the cabin, laughter erupted suddenly from a group of college students near the back, their excitement spilling over into chatter. A child cried softly in 5A, and a mother hummed a lullaby, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempts to remain calm. The smell of coffee mingled with recycled air, masking the faint metallic scent of the plane itself. For most passengers, this was just another flight. Ordinary, mundane, a means to an end. But for a few, that calm held an unspoken tension, an intuition they couldn't articulate. Then, without warning, the cockpit radio crackled, a small, almost insignificant noise at first. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, tapping the intercom. "Control, this is Flight 627, do you copy?" There was no response, only static. He leaned closer, adjusting the dials, trying again. "Control, Flight 627, come in." The static persisted, unbroken, unsettling in its permanence. In the cabin, passengers noticed nothing yet. Conversations continued, music played softly through headphones, children squirmed and fussed. But Sarah, moving past row 14, noticed a flicker of tension on the faces of nearby passengers. A man glanced toward the cockpit door, unconsciously stiffening. A mother clutched her child tighter. It was subtle, but it was there, a ripple in the otherwise calm pond. Reynolds furrowed his brow, glancing at Chen. "Static," he muttered. "It's probably nothing. Let's not panic." Chen nodded, but her eyes betrayed unease. They were trained to remain calm, to analyze and rationalize, but even the most experienced pilots could feel the weight of an unexplainable silence. Back in row 7, A young woman with auburn hair stared out the window, tracing the endless desert below. She sensed something, though she couldn't name it, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. The plane seemed heavier somehow, pressing down with invisible force. She shivered and turned back toward the cabin, noticing a subtle tension in the flight attendants' movements. Their smiles were tight, rehearsed. The illusion of calm cracked in tiny ways, too small to alarm anyone consciously, but enough to seed a deep unease. Reynolds cleared his throat and tried the radio again, his voice steady but laced with authority. Flight 627 to control. We need a status check. Still nothing. Silence stretched across the cockpit like a living thing curling around the controls and instruments. Reynolds felt a chill creep up his spine, not from cold, not from fear. From that instinct pilots learn after decades in the air, the sensation that something was wrong beyond procedure, beyond explanation. Sarah moved down the aisle, checking passengers, offering reassurance she didn't quite feel. A child in 12B whimpered, glancing nervously at the ceiling. A businessman in 3F set down his laptop, frowning at the sudden quiet in the cabin's undercurrent, though everything looked normal. People began exchanging nervous glances, the small signs of anxiety feeding on one another, growing silently. Then a sudden flicker on the cockpit panel, lights blinking erratically, warnings that shouldn't have been there. Reynolds' heart rate quickened, the coffee forgotten. "Laura," his voice was low, tense. Chen leaned in, her fingers moving over the controls instinctively. But the instruments didn't respond as expected. Something in the system was failing, though they couldn't yet pinpoint what. Outside, the sky remained impossibly blue, sunlight glinting off the wings, mocking the turmoil inside. The world beyond the fuselage was calm, serene, almost cruel in its beauty. Reynolds swallowed hard, the first real unease gnawing at his professional composure. The passengers had no idea that in the cockpit, the first cracks in their safety and their lives were forming. As the hum of engines continued, as laughter and the soft cries of children filled the cabin, one thing became horrifyingly clear to Reynolds. Whatever was happening, it wasn't routine, and it wasn't going to wait politely until they were ready. The radio crackled one last time before falling completely silent. No voice, no reassurance, just empty static. And in that silence, a creeping dread filled the cockpit and would soon creep into the cabin. Something was about to happen on Flight 627, something that would change everything in a matter of minutes. Reynolds' hand hovered over the intercom. He opened his mouth to speak, and then nothing. Minutes ticked by, stretching like hours in the cabin of Flight 627. Passengers remained largely oblivious, the hum of the engines and the occasional click of a seatbelt maintaining an illusion of calm. But Sarah Mitchell, the flight attendant who had sensed the subtle unease moments ago, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Something wasn't right. She moved down the aisle again, this time with more purpose, her eyes flicking toward the cockpit door. The intercom remained silent. No captain's voice, no reassuring announcement, just the faint, unnerving vibration of the engines and the mechanical whine of the plane slicing through the sky. At 18C, a teenage boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why isn't the pilot talking?" His voice was barely audible, a whisper that carried more weight than his years should allow. The mother's stomach dropped. "It's probably normal," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She glanced at the cockpit door, hopping for the familiar presence of authority. There was none. Back in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Both radios were dead. Attempts to reset the systems yielded nothing. He glanced at Chen. Her face was pale, eyes wide but composed, a trained mask of professionalism. "Control is silent. Nothing's coming through," she muttered, her fingers dancing over the dials. Reynolds' jaw tightened. He had faced turbulence, engine failures, and electrical anomalies before, but never this. A total, inexplicable communication blackout at cruising altitude. Sarah, sensing growing anxiety among passengers, moved toward the back of the plane. She noticed subtle but unmistakable signs. A man gripping the armrest with white-knuckled intensity, a young woman's trembling hands twisting her necklace, children clinging to parents as if the sudden tension was tangible. The calm of Flight 627 was fracturing. Then it happened. A loud metallic thump echoed through the fuselage, as if the plane itself had inhaled sharply. Passengers jerked in their seats, startled. Flight attendants tried to calm them, but the sound seemed to penetrate the artificial bubble of routine, rattling even the most seasoned travelers. In row 14, Jason Miller, a man in his early 30s with a sharp jawline and the unmistakable bearing of someone trained in high-pressure situations, felt it immediately. Something was off, not just the radio, not just the thump, but the subtle vibration through the floor panels, the way the plane's hum had shifted. He scanned the cabin quickly, noting every twitch of panic, every tightened grip, every unsteady breath. He needed to know what was happening. Jason moved toward the cockpit door, muscles tense, instincts screaming. He pounded once. No response. Twice. Nothing. The locking mechanism held fast, impenetrable to his attempts. Then he noticed movement inside. A shadow flickered across the cockpit window, unnerving in its irregularity. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. His stomach sank. He ran back toward the front cabin, scanning for any flight attendant. "Sarah," he barked. She turned, eyes wide. "There's something wrong with the pilots. I need to get into the cockpit, now." Sarah's hands went to the intercom button, then hesitated. They're unresponsive," she whispered. Her voice trembled, betraying her usual composure. Jason's heart raced. His military training kicked in. Time was not on their side. Every second the cockpit remained silent was a second closer to disaster. In the cabin, panic began to ripple outward like a contagion. A mother screamed as her toddler kicked violently, unsure of why the world had suddenly grown frightening. An elderly man clutched the seat in front of him, sweat beading his forehead despite the cool cabin air. Sarah moved quickly, attempting to calm passengers, but fear spread faster than any reassurances could travel. The illusion of safety had shattered. Jason tried the cockpit door again, this time with a forceful kick. It rattled but held. He turned to Sarah. "We need to get them out. Something's wrong. Both of them." Sarah swallowed hard, fear and professionalism warring across her face. I'll help you, but we need to calm the passengers first, or it's chaos." Meanwhile, the instruments in the cockpit continued their subtle alarms, unnoticed by the passengers but screamed warnings to trained eyes. Altitude was steady, but engine efficiency readings fluctuated unpredictably. Reynolds and Chen slumped forward, eyes half shut, breath shallow. Something, poison, carbon monoxide, was affecting them, but they couldn't react, couldn't communicate. Their bodies were betraying them, and the plane, now pilotless, teetered dangerously between calm and catastrophe. Jason realized the immediate danger. If they didn't regain control, the plane could veer off course into airspace with other commercial flights, or worse, the vast Nevada desert below. He had no experience piloting a commercial jet of this size, but he had enough knowledge to understand the basics. This was no longer a routine flight. It was a life-or-death scenario. Sarah rallied the attendants to help, moving passengers into positions that would protect them during sudden maneuvers. She grabbed a young boy in 5A, whispering, "It's going to be okay. Just trust me." The child clung to her, fear in his eyes, shaking as if the whole plane was alive with threat. Jason returned to the cockpit, banging one final time. "Reynolds, Chen, open up. I know you can hear me." Silence. The only sound was the whine of electronics and the soft shudder of air against metal. His stomach twisted. He glanced through the cockpit window. Both pilots slumped in their seats, motionless. Jason's throat went dry. They weren't just ignoring him. They couldn't respond. He turned back to the cabin. "Everyone listen to me," he shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs of panic. "The pilots are down. I need someone to help me. If we stay calm, we survive. We panic, we die." Passengers froze. The clarity of his command contrasted sharply with the chaos of the moment. Eyes searched for hope, for guidance, and many instinctively followed his gaze. A flight attendant nodded, her own fear tempered by the urgency of his presence. But even as Jason assessed the situation, a new horror unfolded. The instruments in the cockpit began to flicker more aggressively. Warning lights flashed red across the panel, signaling engine inefficiencies, altitude shifts, and unresponsive autopilot systems. The plane shuddered as turbulence began picking up unexpectedly. It was as if the aircraft itself had sensed the absence of control and was struggling to maintain equilibrium. A woman screamed from 21D, "What's happening? Why is the plane shaking?" Her husband clutched her shoulder, eyes wide with terror. Jason's heart pounded. Every second the plane remained pilotless was a second closer to disaster. Sarah grabbed the microphone. Her voice, steady but tinged with fear, carried across the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We have a trained passenger who is working to stabilize the aircraft. Follow instructions and stay in your seats." For a fleeting moment, the passengers obeyed, hanging on to hope like lifelines. But the shaking continued, and the static-filled silence from the cockpit amplified the fear. Outside, clouds began forming, a distant storm creeping across the horizon, unnoticed by most but impossible for the seasoned pilots to ignore. Jason's mind raced. He had to get into the cockpit. He had to figure out what was happening and regain control before it was too late. But with both pilots unconscious, the clock was ticking. Every second of delay increased the risk exponentially. He clenched his fists, took a deep breath, and prepared to kick the cockpit door once more. Behind him, the passengers' panic grew, their fear palpable, contagious. Every eye in the cabin now fixed on him, silently praying that he could do the impossible. Jason's knuckles hit the metal door. It rattled, holding firm. He stepped back, heart racing. He couldn't wait. Lives depended on him. And then, a faint movement from inside the cockpit. A shadow shifted. Something or someone was moving. Jason froze. His pulse thundered in his ears. Was it Reynolds, Chen, or something else entirely? The plane trembled again, more violently this time, as if reacting to the tension inside. Jason knew with gut-wrenching certainty. Whatever was happening in that cockpit, Flight 627 was no longer a routine flight. And in the next few moments, everything would change. Jason Miller's heart thundered in his chest as he stood frozen for a moment, staring at the faint movement in the cockpit. Every instinct screamed danger, yet he had no choice. The lives of 92 passengers, men, women, children, rested on his next move. He inhaled sharply, fighting the surge of panic threatening to paralyze him, and then charged forward. The cockpit door resisted his first push. He rammed it with his shoulder, metal groaning under impact. The lock yielded slightly, but it was clear he couldn't force it open completely with brute strength alone. Jason's mind raced. He needed another approach, a tool. The emergency hatch. No, it was inaccessible from the cabin side. His fingers brushed the door handle one last time, and then he kicked with everything he had. The door swung open just enough to allow him to slip through. Inside the cockpit was a scene of quiet horror. Captain Reynolds slumped forward over the controls, lips slightly parted, his head lolling to one side. First Officer Chen sat rigid, eyes glazed, her hands resting limply on the throttle. Jason froze for a heartbeat, stunned by the reality of two trained professionals rendered useless at the most critical moment. A wave of fear washed over him, but he shoved it down. Hesitation would kill them all. He leaned over, checking Reynolds' pulse with practiced precision. A faint but irregular heartbeat, alive but barely. Chen's pulse was faster, more erratic, her breathing shallow. "We don't have much time," Jason muttered under his breath. His eyes flicked to the instrument panel. The autopilot was offline. The altitude was steady for now, but the airspeed fluctuated, and a warning light indicated a minor engine anomaly that could escalate instantly. Jason's training in the Air Force didn't cover commercial airliners in detail, but he knew enough. The controls weren't unfamiliar, and instinct would guide him. "Okay," he whispered, almost to himself. "You've got this, just keep it steady." He adjusted the yoke slightly, feeling the aircraft respond, the metal frame vibrating through his palms. It was alive beneath him, a massive machine now tethered entirely to his control. From the cabin came the first real sounds of panic. A mother in 17B cried, hugging her child tightly. Flight attendants tried to soothe passengers, but their composure was strained. Jason had to act fast, not just to stabilize the plane, but to prevent chaos in the cabin from spreading. He grabbed the intercom button, voice steady but firm. "This is Jason Miller. The pilots are incapacitated. I need everyone to stay calm and remain in their seats. We are going to get through this together." Static, only static responded. The radio had gone completely silent, and Jason felt a twinge of panic. Ground control could not guide him. He was entirely alone. And yet, the responsibility of 92 lives pressed down on him with crushing weight. He had to fight that pressure, focus on what he could control. Jason assessed the plane's current state, cruising at 35,000 feet, engine stable but fluctuating, autopilot offline. He needed to maintain altitude and heading until he could figure out a way to communicate with the ground. Adjusting the throttle, he nudged the yoke slightly, feeling the aircraft respond. The plane hummed beneath his hands like a living organism, sensitive, reactive, fragile. One wrong move could send them all plummeting. He glanced at the collapsed pilots again. Reynolds' hand twitched slightly. Chen's eyelid fluttered. Time was against him. He couldn't waste precious seconds on hesitation. Jason realized that in order to keep the plane stable, he would need someone else in the cockpit. Someone to help monitor the instruments, someone to react while he focused on keeping the plane level. He turned back toward the cabin. Sarah Mitchell, seeing his eyes on her, understood immediately. She nodded, her fear now tempered by the stark realization of their situation. Jason gestured for her to come forward. She stepped cautiously, her hands shaking but her resolve clear. "Take a look at the engine gauges," Jason instructed. "Keep your eyes on these. If anything spikes, let me know immediately." Sarah nodded, peering at the complex array of dials and lights. Though she was a flight attendant and not trained in piloting, her experience and calm under pressure made her the best ally he could hope for. Jason leaned over the yoke again, his mind moving at lightning speed. He had to maintain altitude, heading, and stability simultaneously. Outside, the sky was deceptively calm, a deep blue expanse stretching endlessly. But he knew better. The illusion of tranquility often precedes disaster. He scanned the horizon through the cockpit windows, noting slight wind gusts, invisible currents, the faint shimmer of heat off the desert below. The plane dipped slightly as a small turbulence hit. Jason adjusted instinctively, thumbs working the yoke like a pianist striking keys. In the cabin, murmurs of panic began to rise. Passengers were whispering, some praying, some staring wide-eyed at the flight attendants. Sarah moved quickly, gently but firmly guiding them into calm breathing and seated positions. She whispered words of reassurance, her own fear buried beneath layers of professionalism and the urgency of survival. Jason's mind raced with possibilities. He needed to regain contact with ground control, but the radio was dead. He considered switching frequencies manually, scanning through emergency channels. Each adjustment required focus, but he had no time to lose. Reynolds stirred slightly, mumbling incoherently, and Jason realized they might regain consciousness, but only if he stabilized the plane first. Then the aircraft shuddered violently. A gust of turbulence, stronger than expected, hit from the side. Passengers gasped, clinging to armrests. Jason gritted his teeth, countering the movement with a precise shift of the yoke. The plane leveled, but it wasn't over. Another tremor hit, this one more violent, rattling the metal frame. Lights flickered. Warning sirens shrieked. Jason's pulse raced as he realized the storm, previously invisible on radar, was approaching faster than any forecast had predicted. Sarah looked at him, eyes wide. "Jason, we can't just keep this steady forever. What do we do if we have to land?" He swallowed hard. Landing. The word brought no comfort. He had no idea where they could safely descend in the vast Nevada desert below. No nearby airports, no prepared landing strips within miles. The thought of attempting an emergency landing on rough terrain sent a chill down his spine. A passenger screamed from the back, a sound that made every nerve in Jason's body tense. A young woman clutched the armrest, eyes wide in terror. Jason turned, fists gripping the yoke. "Everyone stay seated. Hold on, we are going to get through this." His voice was louder, more commanding than before, a lifeline thrown into a sea of fear. But just as he spoke, the plane lurched again, this time more violently. The fuselage shook, metal groaned. A low, ominous creak echoed through the cabin. Jason's stomach lurched. The turbulence wasn't natural. Something was wrong beyond mere weather. The engines hummed erratically, the plane dipping slightly as though testing its own limits. Jason realized that no matter how calm he remained, no matter how precise his control, Flight 627 was a beast with a mind of its own now. The next few minutes would define whether anyone on board survived. He leaned forward again, scanning the instruments. Lights blinked, alarms pulsed. The world outside the cockpit window remained peaceful, cruelly indifferent to the chaos inside. Jason's eyes narrowed. There was no time for fear, only action, only focus. And then a sudden sharp movement from Reynolds. The captain's head lifted slightly, eyes fluttering open, but it was brief. Chen stirred next, a weak, uneven breath escaping her lips. Jason realized with a jolt they weren't completely gone. With luck and with his guidance they might recover in time, but would it be enough? The plane lurched violently again, tossing Jason against the console. His knuckles scraped raw. Instruments screamed. Outside, the first ominous clouds appeared, dark streaks in the distance, an approaching storm ready to challenge everything inside the fragile metal shell. Jason gritted his teeth, gripping the yoke tighter, focusing entirely on the plane. Every passenger, every life on board depended on him now. And in the cockpit, the faint sound of two pilots beginning to stir added a glimmer of hope, but also a terrifying uncertainty. The question lingered like smoke. Would anyone survive the next few minutes? The cockpit of Flight 627 was chaos condensed into metal, wires, and flickering lights. Jason Miller's hands clutched the yoke with raw intensity, knuckles white from pressure, muscles trembling from strain. The plane lurched violently, buffeted by sudden turbulence, wings flexing under the stress. He adjusted the throttle instinctively, feeling the subtle vibrations, listening to the instruments, warnings as if they were a language he barely understood but must obey. Sarah Mitchell leaned over the adjacent panel, scanning dials and gauges. Her training as a flight attendant hadn't prepared her for this, yet her instinct for observation, honed over years of dealing with emergencies, kept her focused. She called out readings, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Engine 2 efficiency dropping. Altitude is holding but barely. We're losing ground, slowly. Jason nodded sharply. Got it. Keep watching, tell me the moment anything spikes. If I get distracted, I need you to scream at me. His voice was tight, commanding. They had no time for hesitation. The passengers, sensing the shifting tension in the cockpit, murmured nervously. A few screamed. A mother clutched her child to her chest, whispering promises she didn't know she could keep. The plane shook again, tossing passengers into seats, spilling drinks, rattling luggage. Sarah glanced back at the cabin through the small cockpit window, faces pale, eyes wide with terror, gripped armrests. Panic threatened to spread, a wildfire that could overpower rational thought. She swallowed, focusing back on the instruments. Jason took a deep breath. He adjusted the yoke, attempting to stabilize the wings, then nudged the throttle forward. The plane responded, but unevenly. One engine strained under load. He noted the shift immediately. Engine 2 was underperforming, sputtering intermittently, threatening to flame out. His pulse quickened. One more wrong adjustment and the aircraft could tilt dangerously, roll unexpectedly, or worse, descend uncontrollably. He glanced at Reynolds, who was beginning to regain consciousness. The captain's eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear battling in his gaze. Chen stirred next, a weak shiver running through her body as she attempted to focus. Jason leaned forward. "Reynolds, Chen, you're awake, but we don't have much time. I need you to help stabilize the plane. Tell me what I'm missing." Reynolds groaned, then blinked rapidly. What happened?" His voice was hoarse, distant. He tried to reach for the controls, but his hands shook violently. I don't know, the radio, everything." Jason gritted his teeth. "No time for explanations. Just follow my lead. We're fighting to keep this plane in the air." He turned back to the yoke, adjusting with extreme precision. The wings flexed. The fuselage groaned. The first raindrops began to streak against the cockpit window, small, glinting like tiny knives. Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "Turbulence increasing, hold steady." She read engine temperatures and pressures aloud, warning Jason of shifts he couldn't sense through the yoke alone. Left engine holding. Right engine fluctuating. Altitude dropping slowly. Jason clenched his jaw. Slowly, methodically, he corrected the tilt, nudging the yoke to counteract the roll. The plane leveled. Then another violent jolt shook them, a gust from the approaching storm, faster and stronger than anticipated. He fought to maintain control, muscles screaming in protest. Every instinct told him to pull back, push forward, tilt, or stabilize, but everything had to be exact. One miscalculation and they'd plummet into the desert below. Reynolds, finally aware, leaned forward, voice trembling. "Jason, throttle right, no left, wait," he coughed, pointing at the flickering instrument. Jason's hands moved automatically, following Reynolds' instructions, then correcting them instinctively when the veteran pilot faltered. Chen's trembling hands hovered over the switches. I can help with the radio," she whispered, but when she tried, static screeched back at them. The intercom was still dead. The plane shuddered violently again, a metallic groan echoing through the cockpit. Jason could feel it in his bones, the strain of the fuselage, the air pushing against every surface, the invisible hands of gravity tugging at the plane, testing their control. He fought to keep the nose level, to maintain altitude, to ensure the engines didn't flame out under the stress. In the cabin, chaos was mounting. Screams mixed with prayers, children sobbing uncontrollably, adults frozen in fear. Sarah moved swiftly through the aisles, placing herself in the path of falling luggage, soothing terrified passengers, forcing a semblance of calm. Her voice was a lifeline, though her hands trembled as she tightened straps, braced bodies, and whispered, "It's okay. It's going to be okay. Stay calm. Stay seated." Jason realized that this wasn't just a battle with the plane. It was a battle with human fear, with panic that could ripple through the cabin and compromise survival. He had to maintain both the aircraft and the fragile minds inside. Another jolt. The warning alarms blared louder. Red lights flashed across the panel. Engine 2 sputtered again. Jason adjusted the yoke, countered the roll, nudged the throttle forward. He could feel the strain in his forearms, the sweat dripping into his eyes. Time slowed as the plane leveled for a fraction of a second, enough for him to breathe. Reynolds coughed, voice hoarse. We need to descend. Emergency landing." His words were cut off by another violent shake. Jason shook his head. Descending too early could be fatal without a runway or flat terrain. The storm outside was growing, invisible turbulence raging beyond the clouds. "Not yet," Jason barked. "We stabilize first, then find a landing zone." Sarah's eyes widened as she saw the storm approaching. Sheets of rain struck the windshield, glinting like shards of glass. The first flashes of lightning illuminated the horizon, and a low rumble of thunder vibrated through the fuselage. The plane's tremors increased. The instruments blinked warning after warning, demanding precision, demanding immediate action. Jason's mind raced. He was balancing instinct, training, and raw courage. He had to fight the plane like a living creature, nudge, counter, tilt, adjust. Every movement mattered. He could not afford even a moment of hesitation. Every second the storm approached faster, every second the plane's engines risked failure. Then Reynolds coughed again, voice stronger. "Jason, we can't help you. We can take over for a bit, but you've got to stay steady. Don't panic." Jason nodded, sweat stinging his eyes. I'm not panicking, just follow my lead. Together they coordinated, 3 minds, 1 goal, survival. And then as the plane crested another turbulent pocket, Jason noticed it, a sudden drop in altitude, faster than expected. The desert below rushed up, faint but undeniable. Passengers braced. The plane's wings flexed violently, metal groaning in protest. Jason's stomach plummeted with them. He adjusted with everything he had. Lights flickered. Alarms screamed. Rain lashed against the cockpit windows. "Hold on," he muttered. "We're not done yet, not even close." The next seconds would define everything. Life, death, and the fragile thread holding Flight 627 together. And then another violent shudder, sharper than before, threw Jason against the controls, almost ripping the yoke from his grasp. The plane teetered on the edge of chaos. Would he hold it together, or would Flight 627 fall into the desert below? The sky darkened as Flight 627 plunged further into the storm. Lightning streaked across the horizon like jagged knives, illuminating the plane in brief, blinding flashes. Thunder rattled the fuselage, vibrating through the seats, the floors, and the bones of every passenger. Rain lashed the windshield in sheets, blurring the desert below into a swirling gray canvas. Jason Miller's hands were white on the yoke, muscles trembling, sweat stinging his eyes. Every fiber of his being screamed that the next seconds would determine who lived and who didn't. Sarah Mitchell leaned over the auxiliary panel, her voice steady but tense. "Engine 2 is fluctuating again. Altitude dropping faster than we can compensate. Brace for turbulence." The words barely registered before a violent lurch shook the plane, tossing Jason against the console. His arms strained to maintain control, fighting against gravity's sudden pull and the merciless wind battering the wings. Passengers screamed. A mother held her crying toddler to her chest as luggage tumbled from the overhead compartments. Flight attendants screamed for calm, their voices drowned out by the roar of the engines and the chaos outside the windows. Panic, raw and unrelenting, spread like wildfire. Every heartbeat was matched by the plane's violent tremors, and each second felt like an eternity. Jason glanced at the partially conscious pilots. Reynolds' eyes flicked open, glazed with fear. "Jason, we need to descend, emergency landing." His voice was strained, each word ragged. Jason shook his head. "Not yet, we stabilize first. I can't risk descending into the desert until we control the plane." Chen's hand trembled as she reached for the controls, and Jason had to pull her back gently, guiding her attention to the instruments. Together, they became a fragile team balancing life and death. The plane's nose dipped sharply, throwing the passengers forward. Screams filled the cabin. Sarah moved quickly, blocking falling luggage and helping frightened passengers brace themselves. "Stay down, hold on, trust us," she shouted over the cacophony, but trust was a fragile thread in the air now, stretched nearly to breaking. Jason gritted his teeth, adjusting the yoke, nudging the throttles, countering each violent gust with precision born of instinct and fear. The plane's wings flexed under the stress, metal groaning, as if the aircraft itself was screaming in protest. A bolt of lightning illuminated the cabin, casting long, jagged shadows across terrified faces. One elderly man in 9A clutched the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white, whispering prayers. Below, the desert stretched endlessly, barren and merciless. There was no flat terrain suitable for landing, no airport, no emergency strip, only rocks, sand, and the harsh, unforgiving landscape that would tear the fuselage apart if the plane touched down. Jason's mind raced. He needed to find a viable spot, but first, the plane had to survive long enough to attempt it. Another violent shudder rocked the fuselage. Engine 2 sputtered, coughing and straining under the stress. Warning lights flashed red across the console. Jason gritted his teeth, adjusting the throttle and nudging the yoke to compensate for the tilt. The plane responded, but the relief was fleeting. The storm was relentless, gusts battering the wings, sheets of rain blinding the view ahead. A child screamed behind him. Jason could feel panic radiating from the cabin, feeding the tension, multiplying it, threatening to overwhelm even the most rational minds. Sarah's voice cut through again, calm but commanding. "Everyone stay seated, fasten seatbelts, brace yourself for turbulence." She moved through the aisles, reinforcing what she could, holding onto frightened passengers, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. Jason's pulse raced. He had to act fast. The plane needed leveling, but every adjustment risked tipping the delicate balance. A miscalculation now could send them spiraling into the desert below. He adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttles, focused entirely on stabilizing the aircraft, blocking out the screams and chaos. Then he noticed movement in the cabin below. A young man in 16F had unbuckled himself and was panicking, trying to reach the front. Jason barked, "Sit down, stay seated," but his voice barely carried over the storm. Sarah rushed down the aisle, guiding the man back, calming him. Every passenger in the cabin was a potential liability now. One sudden movement could destabilize the plane further. The fuselage shuddered violently again, sharper this time, as a wind gust hit from the side. Jason leaned into the yoke, countering the roll with all his strength. The wings groaned, the metal protesting under the immense pressure. He could feel the plane's weight pressing down through his arms, the vibrations traveling up his spine. Outside, lightning flashed again, illuminating the storm in stark, terrifying detail. Rain lashed sideways. Thunder shook the sky. Sarah's voice broke through again, urgency sharpening. "Jason, Engine 2 is failing completely. We're losing power." Jason's mind raced. He had seconds to react. He nudged the throttle forward, praying the engine would respond. Sparks of fear ignited in his chest as he realized that even if he maintained control, the plane might not have enough power to keep altitude long enough to reach a viable landing zone. Reynolds groaned, struggling to focus. "Jason, maybe we can use the canyon." His voice was weak but filled with desperation. Jason's mind snapped to it. There was a narrow canyon below, treacherous but potentially survivable if they could maneuver precisely. But the storm made visibility nearly impossible. Any miscalculation could send the plane smashing into jagged rock walls. Chen's trembling hands hovered over the throttle. I can help guide," she stammered. Jason nodded. Together, the three of them formed a fragile triad of control, fighting against forces far greater than themselves. The plane dipped sharply again. Screams erupted from the cabin. Passengers were thrown against armrests and luggage, some vomiting, some crying. Sarah moved swiftly to protect them, her hands guiding bodies into safer positions. She whispered, "Hold on. You will survive this, trust us." But the storm outside seemed intent on tearing their fragile bubble apart. Jason fought with every ounce of strength, adjusting the yoke, nudging the throttle, countering gusts, stabilizing the plane, all while the instruments screamed warnings of impending disaster. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Muscles ached. Every nerve was taut. The weight of 92 lives pressed down upon him. Lightning flashed directly ahead. Thunder followed instantly, shaking the metal frame. The wind screamed past the fuselage. Jason gritted his teeth. They were descending faster than he wanted, but he had no choice. The canyon below was their only hope. Too high and they'd crash into canyon walls. Too low and the engines might fail. Precision was everything. Sarah's voice broke through the roar. "Jason, watch your left wing. A gust from the canyon entrance." He jerked the yoke, correcting just in time. Sparks of fear shot through him as he realized how close they had come to disaster. Reynolds and Chen murmured directions, faint but helpful, their instincts returning just enough to support him. The plane shuddered again, violently. Outside, lightning illuminated the canyon entrance, dark and foreboding. They were approaching the treacherous descent into terrain that could either save them or end everything. Jason inhaled deeply. Every second, every movement, every decision now carried the weight of life and death. The descent had begun, and the storm showed no mercy. The plane pitched forward, the first true plunge into terror. Would Flight 627 survive the canyon? Or would it become a tomb in the Nevada desert? The canyon yawned beneath Flight 627, jagged and merciless, stretching like a trap designed for disaster. Jason Miller's knuckles were white on the yoke, sweat running down his temple, blurring his vision. Every fiber of his body screamed in tension. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the sheer rock walls that loomed closer with each second. Thunder rolled like a war drum, vibrating through the fuselage. The plane shuddered violently with each gust, and Engine 2 sputtered again, threatening to quit entirely. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut sharply through the chaos, commanding, guiding, a lifeline in the storm. "Jason, keep it steady. Right wing too low." She leaned over the panel, eyes glued to the instruments, tracking every warning light, every flicker of red. She was no pilot, but her calm precision in emergencies made her invaluable. Jason tightened his grip on the yoke, nudging the controls to counter the tilt. The metal groaned, protesting against the violent wind. He could feel every tremor through the plane, every vibration of the wings. Below, the canyon floor flashed in lightning bursts, jagged rocks, sudden drops, twisted cliffs. A single miscalculation and Flight 627 would become a tomb. Reynolds groaned again, barely conscious but trying to speak. "Jason, throttle, ease, then bank left." The captain's voice was hoarse, strained, but his experience shone through. Jason nodded, trusting Reynolds' instincts, adjusting the throttle and banking slightly. The plane tilted, wings screaming under the strain as they narrowly avoided scraping the canyon walls. Chen's trembling hands hovered over the auxiliary controls. I can adjust flaps, help stabilize," she whispered. Jason's eyes met hers and he nodded sharply. Together, the three of them, one barely conscious pilot, one partially recovered pilot, and a civilian passenger, formed a fragile triad of survival. The plane dipped suddenly. A gust from the canyon wall slammed into the fuselage, rocking it violently. Screams erupted from the cabin. Passengers clutched seats, bracing themselves, bodies thrown forward. Sarah moved quickly, reinforcing their positions, whispering urgently, "Hold on, you will survive this. Trust me." The cabin vibrated with fear, metal, and the roaring engines. Jason's mind raced. The descent had to be precise. Too steep and the engines might fail. Too shallow and the canyon walls would tear the plane apart. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the jagged rocks below. The next seconds would be pure instinct, calculation, and courage. He adjusted the yoke, nudging the plane downward just enough to maintain speed without losing altitude too fast. The wings flexed, metal groaning. Engine 2 sputtered, sending a spike of fear down his spine. He nudged the throttle forward, praying the engine would respond. Sparks of panic ignited, but he forced himself to focus. Survival demanded focus. Sarah called out again, her voice sharp. "Left wing too low, adjust now." Jason twisted the yoke, the plane responding with a violent groan. He could feel the edges of catastrophe brushing against him. Reynolds murmured, "Keep it steady, watch the flaps, throttle." Their voices overlapped, guiding him, fragile yet crucial. Another jolt. Another violent shudder. The fuselage screamed in protest as they navigated the canyon's twisting path. Outside, rain lashed against the windows like knives, thunder cracking, and the desert below became a blurred mess of shadowed rocks and sudden drops. Jason adjusted again, sweat stinging his eyes, arms trembling from strain. Passengers were gripping armrests, eyes wide with terror. Children cried, mothers whispered desperate prayers, men muttered under their breath. Sarah moved through the cabin as much as the storm allowed, guiding, steadying, reinforcing. Her presence was a lifeline, each word calculated to maintain calm. Jason's focus narrowed to the instruments, the yoke, and the canyon ahead. Every movement of the plane, every gust of wind, every engine fluctuation demanded immediate reaction. He could feel the strain in his forearms, shoulders, neck. Adrenaline coursed, sharpening his instincts but threatening to burn him out. A flash of lightning illuminated the canyon directly ahead. jagged rock walls rising perilously close. Jason's heart thumped. There was no margin for error. He had to maneuver the plane between walls, stabilize, adjust engines, and maintain speed, all while the storm assaulted them from every angle. "Brace," Sarah shouted. "Brace for turbulence." Another gust slammed the fuselage. The plane tilted dangerously. Jason twisted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and leveled the wings just in time. The cabin groaned, luggage shifted, passengers screamed, but disaster was narrowly averted. Reynolds' voice cut through, faint but commanding. "Jason, you're handling this better than I could. Keep it steady." Jason nodded, clenching his teeth. Praise was meaningless now, only survival mattered. Chen's voice trembled but joined in. "Throttle balance, you can do it." Another gust slammed them. Engine 2 sputtered again, threatening to fail. Jason adjusted, flaring the nose slightly, countering the tilt. The plane groaned violently but held. Another lightning flash revealed the canyon walls ahead, rising abruptly, jagged edges threatening to shred the fuselage. Jason inhaled, focusing entirely. The impossible maneuver demanded every ounce of concentration, every reflex, every shred of courage. His mind calculated angles, distances, speed, and turbulence in a fraction of a second. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, fear pressed like a physical weight, passengers gripping their seats, eyes wide, clinging to hope. Sarah's voice was steady, guiding, a lifeline. "Left wing clear, right wing adjust now." Jason twisted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and the plane leaned violently, scraping closer to the canyon walls than any sane person would dare. Metal groaned, lights flickered, and alarms blared, but the plane held. Then a new terror. Engine 2 sputtered violently, flames licking the panel, sparks flying. Jason's pulse raced. A total engine failure could spell doom, but Reynolds murmured, guiding him. "Throttle, balance, flaps. Yes, hold it." Jason followed, every movement calculated, precise, desperate. The canyon walls rushed past in flashes of gray and brown, illuminated by lightning. The plane dipped, rose, twisted violently, and yet somehow Jason kept it steady. Sarah's voice called out instruments readings, Reynolds and Chen offered guidance, and together they danced on the edge of disaster. Passengers clutched seats, bracing, eyes wide, some screaming, some praying. The roar of the engines, the wind, the storm, the fear, all collided into a chaotic symphony of survival. Jason's body ached, muscles trembling from the effort. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. And then, just when it seemed impossible, he saw a break in the canyon ahead, a narrow, slightly flattened stretch. The engines roared. The plane leaned into the final adjustment. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the strip like a stage. Jason gritted his teeth. Every ounce of skill, courage, and luck had brought them here. One final maneuver, one perfect alignment, and Flight 627 might survive. But the storm wasn't finished yet. A gust slammed the fuselage just as the plane began its approach, wings flexing dangerously. Metal screamed. The cabin shook violently. Passengers screamed, bracing, some crying, some whispering prayers. Jason held the yoke tighter than ever, muscles screaming, adrenaline surging. "Hold on," he shouted. "We're going to make it." And in that instant, the impossible was within reach. But Flight 627 still had one final challenge to face before salvation. The canyon's jagged walls loomed on either side, flanking Flight 627 like the jaws of a trap. Jason Miller's hands were locked on the yoke, every nerve screaming in hyper-alert focus. His vision tunneled, filtering out the screaming passengers, the storm, the chaos, and focusing solely on the narrow strip ahead, their only chance at survival. Lightning flashed above and behind them, illuminating the turbulent sky in stark white bursts, shadows slicing across the fuselage. Rain lashed against the windshield, blurring the jagged desert below into a chaotic canvas of gray and brown. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the storm's roar, calm but urgent. "Speed steady, altitude holding, engine 2 holding barely." Her fingers danced over the instrument panel, tracking every fluctuation with deadly precision. She was the passenger's lifeline now, the only anchor to sanity amidst panic. Jason adjusted the yoke minutely, banking slightly to avoid scraping the canyon walls. The metal groaned in protest. Sparks of panic rippled up his spine, but he pushed them aside. He had to hold the plane steady, maintain airspeed, and align perfectly with the narrow, flat section below. One mistake could spell doom. In the cabin, passengers were a mass of fear. Screams, prayers, sobs, and the sharp metallic clatter of luggage filled the air. Children cried, gripping parents tightly, their tiny bodies trembling. Mothers and fathers whispered desperate reassurances they barely believed themselves. Flight attendants moved with precision, anchoring bodies, guiding passengers to brace, whispering commands over the storm's roar. Jason's mind worked in overdrive. He calculated angles, wind gusts, engine efficiency, flaps, and the plane's weight in a fraction of a second. Reynolds, partially conscious, muttered directions, guiding him through procedures with the last remnants of his training. Chen's trembling hands hovered over auxiliary controls, assisting wherever possible, though fear still clouded her focus. The plane shuddered violently as another gust slammed into the fuselage from the side. Jason adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and leveled the wings just in time. The plane groaned but remained airborne. He swallowed hard, adrenaline coursing through every vein. The canyon walls rushed past in jagged flashes, illuminated by lightning, reminding him how narrow their margin for error truly was. "Left wing too low, adjust." Sarah's voice was sharp, cutting through the chaos. Jason twisted the yoke violently, rolling the plane just enough to clear a rocky outcrop. The metal screamed in protest. Sparks of fear erupted in his chest. The canyon floor rushed up beneath them, rocks and scrub blurring in terrifying proximity. Another gust slammed the plane. Engine 2 sputtered, coughing, threatening to fail entirely. Jason forced the throttle forward, praying it would hold. Reynolds groaned, pointing at instruments. "Throttle balance, flaps don't stall." Jason adjusted, leaning on every ounce of skill, instinct, and courage. The plane responded, tilting violently but stabilizing just enough. Sarah glanced at the cabin through the small cockpit window. Passengers were bracing, screaming, clinging to armrests and seats, faces pale and wide-eyed. She whispered desperately, "We're almost there, stay calm, you'll survive this." Her voice carried authority, hope, and the raw urgency of a life-or-death moment. Jason's pulse thundered as he approached the narrow landing strip. The flat section was barely visible, a thin ribbon of dirt and gravel amidst the jagged canyon. He had less than a minute to align perfectly. One misjudged angle, one gust of wind, one sputtering engine, and Flight 627 would meet the unforgiving desert in a catastrophic crash. "Speed steady, watch your descent rate," Reynolds barked weakly. Jason adjusted the yoke slightly, leveling the nose. The plane groaned under the strain. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the narrow strip. His heart skipped a beat. There it was, their only chance. Sarah's voice broke through, urgent and precise. "Throttle, ease slowly, don't stall." Jason complied, muscles screaming in protest as he feathered the throttle, letting gravity guide them downward. The plane dipped, shuddered, and then stabilized. Sparks of hope flickered amidst the fear. The canyon walls seemed to close in as they descended. Lightning flashed, thunder cracking like a whip. Rain lashed the windshield. The plane shuddered violently as turbulent gusts struck. Jason gritted his teeth, adjusting constantly, guided by Reynolds' murmured directions and Sarah's precise instrument readings. Every second felt like a lifetime. "Brace, brace, brace," Sarah shouted into the cabin. Passengers instinctively obeyed, gripping seatbacks, clutching loved ones, faces etched with terror. The plane dipped further, nearing the landing zone. Rocks flashed by. Engine 2 sputtered again, but held. Jason leaned into the yoke, muscles burning, eyes locked on the strip. Reynolds coughed, then muttered, voice barely audible, "Just keep steady, trust the controls." Chen added, trembling, "We can do this together," Jason nodded, leaning into the collective focus of their fragile team. The landing strip loomed. Dirt kicked up as they neared. Gusts threatened to push them off course, but Jason's hands were steady, guided by adrenaline and desperation. The plane shuddered violently as the wheels touched the rough gravel. The landing gear groaned under impact. The fuselage trembled. Dust erupted like a storm around them. Sparks flew as the nose wheel touched, metal screeching against the uneven surface. Jason kept the yoke steady, throttles adjusted, countering every irregularity, every rock, every jolt. The plane skidded but remained upright. Sarah's voice cut through, trembling but relieved. We're holding." Passengers gasped, some crying, some staring wide-eyed in disbelief. Children clutched parents, whispers of prayers breaking into tears of relief. Flight attendants moved quickly, bracing, securing, guiding everyone through the final seconds. The plane's wheels hit a particularly uneven patch. The fuselage jolted violently, metal screeching. Jason's teeth clenched. The nose dipped dangerously. Engine 2 sputtered. Reynolds groaned, weak but commanding. "Steady, steady, just keep it." Jason leaned into the yoke, nudged throttle forward, adjusted flaps. The plane shuddered violently again. Then finally, wheels skidded across the final stretch. Gravel sprayed. The fuselage trembled. Sparks and dust erupted as Flight 627 came to a halting stop. The plane shuddered once, twice, then lay still. Silence, a fragile, trembling silence, descended upon the aircraft. Sarah exhaled, voice shaking. We made it." Jason's hands fell from the yoke, trembling. Muscles screamed in protest, sweat pouring down his face. He looked around, taking in the passengers. Faces pale, wide-eyed, some crying, some shaking, but alive. Children clung to parents. Adults embraced, trembling. Relief collided with fear in raw, overwhelming waves. Reynolds groaned, leaning back. "You saved everyone," he coughed, eyes closing briefly. Chen slumped against the panel, trembling but alive. Jason allowed himself a single, exhausted exhale. They had done it. Against impossible odds, Flight 627 had survived. But as the storm raged above and around the canyon, a faint unease lingered. Every passenger, every crew member, and Jason himself knew the danger was over for now. But Flight 627 had only just survived the impossible. The engines hissed and trembled as Flight 627 came to a grinding halt on the narrow canyon strip. Dust swirled around the plane, coating passengers, clothes, and faces in a fine layer of grit. Inside, silence fell like a heavy, fragile blanket, broken only by the occasional cough, whimper, or the faint metallic creak of the stressed fuselage. Jason Miller's hand still gripped the yoke, knuckles white, muscles trembling, sweat dripping into his eyes. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended, every passenger frozen between relief and disbelief. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the stillness, calm yet urgent. "Everyone, stay seated. Do not move yet. The storm is not over." She moved through the aisles, ensuring passengers were strapped in, guiding frightened children to cling to parents, whispering reassurances. Faces pale from fear now began to register the first flickers of hope. Jason finally released the yoke, leaning back against the console, exhaustion weighing him down like a physical force. His mind replayed every moment. The impossible maneuvers, the sputtering engine, the canyon walls that had nearly torn them apart. His chest heaved, adrenaline slowly ebbing, leaving raw fatigue in its wake. Beside him, Reynolds leaned weakly against the panel, coughing, but a flicker of pride and relief softened his exhausted features. Chen, still trembling, reached over to touch the throttle. We did it," she whispered, voice quivering. Jason nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The enormity of what they had survived, the near-impossible descent, the storm, the canyon settled over him. They had done it. Against all odds, 92 lives were still intact. In the cabin, murmurs of astonishment and relief began to rise. Some passengers were crying softly, hugging loved ones. Children peeked wide-eyed from behind arms, trying to comprehend that they were still alive. Mothers whispered prayers of thanks, fathers pressed foreheads together with wives, and strangers clutched hands in quiet solidarity. Flight attendants moved quickly, helping anyone who was unbuckled or shaken, reinforcing the fragile calm that now existed in the aftermath of terror. Jason looked out the cockpit window. The storm still raged above, lightning streaking across the sky, rain lashing against the windshield. The canyon stretched around them, jagged and merciless. The landing had been miraculous, but the plane was far from safe. Every passenger was alive, but Flight 627 itself bore the marks of the storm's fury: twisted metal, sparks from overloaded systems, and a dangerously sputtering engine that could fail at any moment. He turned to Reynolds. "We need to shut down, assess damage, and make sure the passengers can evacuate safely if necessary." Reynolds nodded, swallowing hard. "Agreed, you did incredible taking control like that. You saved everyone." The words were hoarse but genuine, and Jason felt a lump rise in his throat. Praise had never felt so heavy with responsibility. Sarah moved toward the cockpit. "Jason, we need to talk to the passengers, reassure them, and organize an evacuation if needed. The storm isn't over and the strip is unstable." Jason nodded, pushing himself upright despite exhaustion. He realized that even after the impossible landing, the danger hadn't completely passed. The storm, the remote location, and the fragile aircraft meant they were still on borrowed time. Jason stepped into the cabin. The atmosphere was surreal. Passengers were shaken but alive, wide-eyed, whispering to one another, some still gripping loved ones, refusing to believe they had survived. He raised his hands, voice steady despite the fatigue and strain. "Everyone, please remain calm. You're all safe for now. Flight 627 has landed and everyone survived thanks to incredible teamwork. I promise you, we will get through the rest of this together." A ripple of relief passed through the cabin. People hugged, cried, whispered prayers of thanks, but the tension lingered. The storm outside reminded them that survival was not yet guaranteed. Jason moved swiftly, coordinating with Sarah and the partially recovered pilots. They instructed passengers to remain seated, secured children with extra straps, and prepared for a potential evacuation if the plane could not remain operational. Reynolds coughed, then looked at Jason, eyes heavy but resolute. You took control when no one else could. You saved them all." His words, hoarse but sincere, struck Jason with the full weight of what had just occurred. He had been a passenger, an unlikely hero, suddenly thrust into a situation no one should ever face. And yet he had acted. He had survived. They all had survived. Outside, the storm continued, lightning illuminating the canyon in brief, blinding flashes. The plane's fuselage trembled under the wind, rain pounding mercilessly. Every moment reminded them that while the landing had been successful, they were far from safe. The narrow strip could shift, the engines could fail, and the canyon walls loomed dangerously close. Evacuation might be their only option if the aircraft could not remain stable. Jason returned to the cockpit, checking systems, engines, and instruments. He relayed instructions to Sarah and the passengers. Together, they stabilized the plane as best as possible. The engine groaned, threatening to quit, but held for now. Reynolds and Chen assisted, guiding procedures as their strength returned. In the cabin, whispers of disbelief and gratitude filled the air. Children clung to parents, tear-streaked faces, strangers embraced. They had survived the impossible: the storm, the canyon, the failing engines, and the death-defying descent. For a fleeting moment, relief washed over everyone, overwhelming the fear that had dominated them for hours. Jason allowed himself a brief exhale, exhaustion pressing down. He thought of the split-second decisions, the impossible maneuvers, the lives he had held in his hands. It had been a surreal, terrifying ordeal, but they had made it, together. Yet the storm still raged, a reminder that while they had survived the landing, Flight 627 remained fragile, suspended between safety and danger. Jason's eyes scanned the horizon, calculating, planning, preparing. They were alive, but not yet free. Finally, Sarah moved beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You saved them, Jason, all of them. I've never seen anyone handle a crisis like that, not even the pilots. He nodded silently, the weight of her words sinking in. Relief and exhaustion collided in his chest. Jason looked around at the passengers now beginning to calm, at Reynolds and Chen recovering, at Sarah's determined composure. They had done the impossible. They had survived. But the memory of the storm, the canyon, the plane teetering on the edge of disaster would stay with them forever. He exhaled deeply, whispering under his breath, "We made it. We actually made it." Outside, the storm began to relent slightly, lightning flashes less frequent, wind easing. Flight 627 rested on the fragile canyon strip, battered but alive, carrying 92 passengers who would never forget the day the impossible was survived. And though the plane was grounded, the fear, the adrenaline, the sheer weight of survival would linger long after the engines cooled and the dust settled. Jason Miller, ordinary passenger turned unlikely hero, allowed himself one fleeting smile, knowing that in the face of impossible odds, courage, focus, and determination had triumphed. For Flight 627, grounded but not defeated, life had won. For now.